When people have fear from seeing graffiti, that's because of a media conception of like danger and violence. That means that if you need a visual shorthand for like, you know, a kind of destitute part of the city, you just show somewhere with like trash in the wind and then some graffiti. There's no actual reason that graffiti should be something which is feared.
Rafael Schacter is an anthropologist, curator, and author known for his clear, deep love for graffiti and independent public art. Schacter approaches graffiti not merely as a visual expression, but as a vital cultural phenomenon that deserves serious academic and artistic consideration. His work challenges traditional views on graffiti, positioning as a complex and meaningful form of urban communication. Through his work, Schacter has created new platforms that bring graffiti from the streets into formal cultural institutions, fostering dialogues about its social significance and artistic merit. His latest book, Monumental Graffiti, invites us, the audience, to consider graffiti as a monument, in the word's most etymological sense. Throughout this conversation, we explore what exactly he means by this and get right into the heart of one of the world's most ancient but somewhat vilified modes of communication. This video has been entirely self-funded. If you get something out of it and would like to help support this channel, there's a link in the description where you can buy me a coffee and help keep these releases regular. Also, I had some slight technical issues with the focus on my second camera towards the end of this interview. Apologies for that. Hopefully it doesn't affect your experience too much. Rafael Schacter, thank you for agreeing to do this. Thank you for sitting down with me. I understand that this is obviously the culmination of a lot of work, putting together a book. We're inside the Camden Art Center at an exhibition space. How do you feel at this moment?
I feel great. I feel amazing to be at Camden. Camden Art Center is genuinely like my favorite art space in the UK. I grew up in the area. It's an incredible mix of like a really community space, but actually also super high level of like institutional art. So it's amazing to be here, to have had that opening here, and to have this kind of small exhibition here as well.
This might be a reductive question, but I think it's important for us to kind of come to a collective agreement on when we're using these concepts and this terminology. So in your eyes, at this exact moment, what is graffiti?
Cool. I think it's a great question. It's not a reductive question. It's not a simple question. It's a super important one. In the book, very much at the start, I outline what I mean by graffiti and what I mean by monuments. And with graffiti, it's very much focused on what I would call graffiti with a capital G. So not just political markings in the street, not markings on like school desks or toilets, all of which is also super interesting, but actually focused on the practice of graffiti emerging from the east coast of the US in late 60s, early 70s, distributed throughout the world through forms such as subway art and other kind of forms of media that has become a huge global practice. Something which I really think is probably the most practiced form of art, definitely public art in the world, but very much focused on what is a genre of practice, a genre of, I would say, art that has emerged from the 70s in the US and then today being distributed worldwide.
When you're going to do some kind of like rigorous intellectual research on something like graffiti, what is the ultimate aim for you? What's the ultimate aim of deciding to look at this through the lens of a monument?
That's a great question. So I think in general terms, when intellectualizing or academicizing something, one of the things that is of the greatest concern is not to just destroy it, basically. To like look at it so much, you just kind of leave it kind of meaning nothing. So I'm an anthropologist. That means like I study what humans do, how social relationships are formed, like what culture is. So looking at art practice, whether or not you think graffiti is art or vandalism, it is an aesthetic practice, whether it's illegal or not. So looking at it and trying to understand it from the inside out. So not just as a visual form, but as a practice, as a cultural form, and looking at that ethnographically, which all that means is really working closely on a long-term basis, not just doing interviews, but like understanding how people live their lives in a much larger sense, is the way that anthropologists come to their understandings of what they're looking at. So my work is not just about what I think. My work comes from thousands of conversations, from thousands of minutes, hours of time spent with people working within this kind of wider culture. So that's how I would go about on a kind of an intellectual or an academic journey of researching something. And the monument idea was just a way of getting into that. So it was kind of a conceit or a kind of technique from which I could get inside of these ideas and then start to pull them apart.
The book starts with asking us the question, what if we saw graffiti as a monument? Now, obviously you spent 360 pages going into why we should look at this, but for the purposes of this conversation today, can you give us a little sort of like a rough idea of how you started this journey and what you kind of your top line ideas are within this?
The monument idea really came out of my teaching, first and foremost. So I've been teaching since 2016 a course called Art in the Public Sphere. And much of that course, the ideas came from my work on graffiti and street art, but I was more formally teaching around public art, kind of more institutional public art. And of course, one of the key things of the last 10 years has been monumental destruction, whether that's of Edward Colston or Confederacy monuments. There's been a real kind of turn to kind of reflect on what these public monuments, these institutional monuments are really doing. So also I was kind of thinking about the way that monuments have been, starting to be destroyed, but also the way that graffiti is destroyed, like on a kind of daily basis. And then also thinking about the idea of monument in more general. So a monument is just a reminder, an advice, or a warning. That's from like etymologically where the word comes from, which is monere, it's Latin. It just means a reminder, an advice, or a warning. So the fact that we think about monuments within this kind of structure of like big, stony, permanent, often male, like heroic, military or like monarchical kind of structures is just a particular way that we think about monuments now. That is of like a very kind of particular narrative, a very particular history of like Western monuments when nation states started emerging. So actually, there's nothing to say that a monument in its concept as a reminder, an advice, or a warning has to come through the form of traditional monuments. So I just thought, okay, well, graffiti can act as a reminder, it can act as advice, it can act as a warning, right? So what happens if we say, okay, graffiti is a monument, we frame it like that, what then would emerge if we do that?
And talk to me about some of the pillars of this framework.
I look at kind of three elements in the book. I look at graffiti as form, graffiti as message, and graffiti as trace. And those first two parts, form and message, really make up like what the kind of the object is, and then what the practice of making the object is. And in both those senses, it also kind of reflects and juxtaposes with what traditional monuments are. So for example, I think about time, right? The way that all monuments have like a time to them. And with with institutional monuments, it's all about permanency. All about this idea that they must last forever. Of course they don't, right? They have to be constantly conserved, cleaned, protected to have this kind of image of permanency. But at its basis, graffiti totally reverses that, right? It is an object which is more about impermanency, ephemerality. You know when you're producing an object, it's going to disappear. So it has a very opposing framework from the traditional monument. But actually there are many kinds of monuments in different cultures around the world, or many different ways we think about memory in which something disappearing can actually provoke and like make our memory permanent more than it's still existing. There's an idea that because monuments are permanent, we can just forget things because it's kept in the monument. Whereas if graffiti disappears, you're kind of forced to remember it, or you're forced to look at it in a different way because you know it's going to disappear. So in that chapter, thinking about time, it's not that, graffiti is impermanent, so it's not a monument. It's actually graffiti is impermanent, so it reminds, it advises, it warns in a different way. And there are lots of examples actually of different kind of monumental forms that do work through disappearance, that do work through ephemerality. So each chapter, whether it's thinking about site specificity, whether it's thinking about style, whether it's thinking about time, it's all saying, okay, well, how does graffiti actually work? So what does it do in this city? What does it do in its practice? And comparing that with traditional monuments, but saying it's still a monument nonetheless.
If you ask or I'm sure you might have already asked in your countless hours of interviewing artists, what is the kind of general consensus of why people do graffiti, and how does that relate to your understanding of why graffiti and the role of graffiti in the city? You know, are these two kind of connected ideas and strains of thought? Or are you kind of like going off and going, actually what's happening here is kind of coming at it from a, you know, anthropological point of view?
That's a really great question. I think it's very often that sometimes like, ideas can flow so far away from practice, and I'm like really keen to, even if I'm talking about it like in a kind of intellectualized way at points, it always comes back to what is actually happening, right? If I get that wrong, the project has failed, right? On the first hand, you know, when people start graffiti, they're often very, very young, right? And, you know, from like 8, 9, 10, 12. So there may be different conceptions of doing it when you first start to when you start to actually get into it. And one of the critical things that people have talked about to me for years is that it is something that is done, right? Graffiti is not just the image, it's the practice, it's the performance. In fact, 10 Foot's performance that he did here on Thursday night was all about the doing of graffiti. Like, there was a tiny bit where he talked about the image itself, but really it was all about the process, the act, like the 24 hours before doing it, to the actual doing it, to the afterwards, the after effects of it. So the producing of graffiti is something I talk about a lot, and that is something that all artists have always said is key to me. You know, is it 50% about the performance and 50% about the image, or maybe more about the performance? So definitely there's a really tight connection between the arguments I try to make and what I've been kind of taught, and like the knowledge that I've been given by graffiti writers I've spoken to for years.
What are some of the big takeaways that you've gotten over the years? If I asked you to kind of give me like skip to the end of the book, what are some of you? I haven't quite made it that far. I only got the copy yesterday. But if I could prompt you for one, what would you say is some of your big takeaways that you've maybe kind of like uncovered, or sort of a light bulb moment that maybe it wasn't your original line of thought or how you would have perceived it?
Okay, it's also a really great question. I think definitely for me, I think it's dangerous to think about graffiti as something that just tells you about something else. I think at its heart, it is a visual form and it is a performative practice that itself holds value in itself. Like the way it is done, the way it looks is integral to itself. But it does so much more than just that, because it is a public act, it is a public art, it is in the city. So I think really the kind of one of the key take-homes for the book, apart from just talking about it as what it is and what it does, is what it says about the city. You know, I think graffiti is incredibly important in seeing where our like contemporary cities are going, in terms of privatization of space, in terms of our ability to be in private in space, in terms of like gentrification, in terms of spectacularization, in terms of the way that we are able to actually use the city. Like graffiti writers, they use the city, they are part of the city, the way they navigate the city, the way they understand the city, the way they feel the city. So I think that for me is such a critical way of understanding public space, like urban space today, to really think about what we can actually learn from the way the graffiti writers really understand the city in an incredibly intimate and also like affective way.
How important then do you think writing either like your book, or I'm thinking in particular how much coverage that 10-foot article in the FT from last year got? What kind of impact does writing like this in whatever medium or format, like how does that impact the culture in terms of the people doing it and the reception that it gets?
I think after the opening here on Thursday, I was speaking to lots of writers, some very active writers, and one of the best feelings for me is to have that feedback with people where there is a feeling that something like could be happening, right? That this actually might be having like an impact, because let's be clear, right? People are still going to prison for doing graffiti, right? There are countless examples of illegal advertising, illegal billboards all over the city. Yet that is kind of like a blind eye is like given to that. And there are still writers going to prison, category A prisons, for putting pigment on the surface, right? So in a general sense, trying to push like the understanding, push the envelope of what graffiti is, has a real, like a super important like effect, or it could have. So trying to reframe how graffiti is understood is something by the wider culture, is something that I am very passionate about. And I think the more we can write about it in ways that aren't repeating the same analysis that we've had for 40 years is super important. I mean, look, there was an article in the Times the other week, and it could have been written in 1984, not 2024. Like, the tropes that were being used were so incredibly boring.
Well, let's stay in that then. Give me an example of what some of the tropes are that you'll see in kind of tabloid journalists writing about a culture that they really have absolutely no clear interest in or interest in understanding.
Yeah, in terms of the tropes used about graffiti, I mean, there's this constant idea of like the kind of hoodied, like violent, like lone individual, like scouring the city. It's like the most opposite way that what actually happens. Maybe the hoods still happen, but it's such like a communal act. It's such a participative act. It's something that happens together. Graffiti is actually not a violent crime. I mean, I'm not trying to say that there isn't graffiti beef. Of course there is, right? But it's not. People don't go to prison for graffiti for violence. They go to the prison for graffiti for pigment on surface, for what seemed to be a financial crime. So firstly, it's not like a violent practice. It's not a lone activity. It's not undertaken by like disaffected youth. It's like there's a whole range of different practitioners. But I think it's also the way that the focus becomes like on graffiti rather than all the other like much more like structural, much deeper problems of our cities nowadays. I mean, I can talk about London in particular because that's where I'm from. And like London, 14 years of like Conservative Party rule has just totally destroyed public services, right? Graffiti writers become an easy target. It's the classic broken windows theory, which has been totally debunked.
Just for context and for due diligence, can you just maybe explain what you mean by broken windows theory?
Yeah, so the idea with broken windows theory is that if you remove like the small crimes, like the broken windows, that will have a trickle up effect on the big crimes, right? It was most famously undertaken by Rudy Giuliani in the 80s in New York.
Somebody urinates in public, the person is telling you, I got a big problem. This is what broken windows theory is all about.
But it just displaced people, and it displaced crime. It didn't actually affect the bottom line of the kind of the structural effects of what creates crime. So likewise with the way people speak about graffiti today, as if you remove graffiti, suddenly all the kind of the loss of infrastructure, the loss of finances and public services is going to transform. So I could talk about this for hours and get kind of deeper and deeper, but the bottom line issue for me is that graffiti has been, the way graffiti is understood is 40 years following the war on graffiti. A war on graffiti which obviously been lost, right?
Yeah, the Americans obviously came up with that one. They love a war on something.
No, exactly, and it's a media war, and the way that graffiti, when people have fear from seeing graffiti, that's because of a media conception of danger and violence. That means that if you need a visual shorthand for a kind of destitute part of the city, you just show somewhere with trash in the wind and then some graffiti. It's kind of become this visual shorthand to mean something where there's no actual reason that graffiti should be something which is feared, right? In its essence as an art form, aesthetic in itself. So that's why I try, in a lot of my work to just kind of say, okay, well, what is actually happening here? Let's remove the hierarchies of value that place graffiti outside of art, if not at the very bottom, and then art, which would be normally the Camden Art Center at the top. Let's remove that category and just say, it's just words in the city, and there are words all over the city. There's shop signage, there's advertising, there's street signage, there's retail signage, there's words everywhere. So what is it in particular around graffiti that makes it so feared, especially when advertising is just, if not, well, is for me obviously much more visually pollutive, offensive, large scale, dominating.
Psychologically damaging.
Absolutely. And this is something, so I think actually that's one of the things that is a very as an anthropologist is useful in that we can see, okay, well, everyone thinks advertising is totally fine, but graffiti is really bad. So just take that and say, well, why is that? And start to unpack that, because clearly it's not a natural like way of understanding our like visual culture and environment. So why is that? And like, how can we start to try and change that by having a more kind of, like just a more kind of outward like idea of visualizing what is actually happening here.
So in this understanding then, we're talking about graffiti. So what makes this scary thing different to one of the more sanctioned forms or accepted forms of what we would refer to more as street art or a mural or something like that? What's the kind of the anthropological core differences between the way that these forms of messaging are received and what makes this graffiti word still 50 years later, 60 years later, still so loaded?
So I think there's two aspects, right? There's firstly value. Right, so street art has economic value. So it is seen by kind of institutions, whether that is art spaces or whether that is galleries or whether it is kind of local councils, to have value, to kind of transform an area, but also value like literal kind of economic value. So on the one hand, it's positioned in a scale in which, you know, graffiti is still considered to be kind of pollutive and valueless, i.e. you must destroy it. But street art has like a possibility of value. And actually, if you look in a lot of the kind of local councils' codes of conduct and like reports around the differences between graffiti and street art, a lot of it does come down to that kind of idea of value.
So where does that value come from?
Well, I mean, that value comes from the literal idea of like taking it off the street and selling it at auction.
Oh, right, the actual physical
So there's a
removal.
literal economic value, like, you know, classically with invaders and with Banksys, but there's an idea that, oh, this is now like art because it has economic value. So there's kind of a relationship between an aesthetic value and an economic value that places it on a particular scale. But equally, street art is a more outward-looking aesthetic compared to graffiti, which is often seen to be a more inward-looking aesthetic. Right? So graffiti is written for graffiti writers first and then the city, whereas I think with street art, it's more outwardly going towards the city before it then goes to its kind of inward community. So there's definitely like a different kind of way of reaching outwards or reaching inwards, which of course does have a different effect on its viewership. But I think more than anything, it comes down to that idea of value, of like economic value and aesthetic value, which are so tightly linked to each other. And graffiti will still always be, well, it's still so often considered to be pollutive because it has no economic value.
If graffiti then becomes more socially accepted by the wider public and suddenly it's less demonized by tabloid journalism, does that then take away the motivation for engaging with it? Does it then devalue this entire practice?
So I think for graffiti writers, and of course there are a variety of feelings around this, but...
I quickly speak on behalf of every single graffiti.
Exactly. So for many graffiti writers that I've spoken to, I talk about illegality in the book, right? But I try not to focus too much on it, in that there is often this idea that graffiti writing is all about illegality, like breaking the law, like going against, right? But actually that going against, like kind of going against what the city is supposed to like be letting you do, can actually go way beyond just like criminal codes, right? So going against the way the city looks, the structure of the city, the kind of the way we're supposed to act in the city, which graffiti clearly does, doesn't mean that it's simply about like, you know, doing something illegal. So I think legality is like a critical way of understanding graffiti practice, but it's not the way to understand it. So it's much more, for me, as I understand it, it's more important to be active in the city, to engage in the city, to commit to the city, than to like be breaking the law, right? That is kind of like a side effect of like the real motivation, which is to be engaging with the city and with your community. So I think on the one hand, legality is key but not critical. On the other, there are many cities in the world, like, you know, Athens and Berlin, like coming to mind, for example, where graffiti is accepted, right? Where it's not like totally like a non-story, but there is an acceptance that people are going to use the city, and there has to be an acceptance of like differences of opinion of how the city is used. So I don't think that it's simply about like making people think, okay, graffiti is fine, graffiti is great. Graffiti is a response to the city. And in particular, cities where the response to graffiti is more harsh, like London, there's often a more harsh graffiti. So I think there's a really kind of symbiotic relationship between the way graffiti is treated and the graffiti that you get in a city. But I think it's more just about thinking beyond graffiti itself as being this kind of like evil that is kind of like, destroying our cities, and starting to think, okay, well, who are we making cities for? What are these cities meant to be doing? And who are cities actually enabling, and who are they disabling?
In your understanding then, what does a city's attitude towards graffiti tell us about the people there? Like, what separates people in Berlin or Bogota to those in, Cologne or Leeds?
So often people say to me, how can a city get kind of better public art, or better street art, or kind of, more kind of rich public culture? And my answer to that was normally institute rent caps, right? So rather than trying to create a particular kind of funding push, it's more the other way around. But actually, I think it's more that you can see ideas of publicness, what the kind of general idea of what publicness is in cities, kind of replicating itself in graffiti policies. In that, on the one hand, there's kind of this Northern European, kind of Southern European, outside, inside kind of cultures that you could look at in more kind of a general sense. But it's also who do we want in the city? I think what you can see with graffiti is a reflection of how a city is kind of amenable to different ways of inhabiting it, different ways of really being part of the city. I mean, London kind of invented, anti-skateboarding, anti-skateboarding, little kind of metal nubbins, or, the
anti-homeless spikes.
Yeah, exactly, anti-homeless spikes, just the hostile architecture in more general. I think thinking about the hostility of cities is really important, and graffiti for me becomes almost like a weather vane for that, right? How a city responds to graffiti becomes similar to how it responds to ideas of publicness or ideas of difference, which you might not like, but it's not always about you, basically. So I think thinking about the different, and getting to this larger point, is really what I think graffiti helps to let us understand about how a city could be, right? There are many different ways of seeing a city, and things that I might find ugly in a city, someone else might find beautiful. So difference, really, and the ability to have difference in the city is, I think, vitally important. And it's equally not as if graffiti writers don't have a very clear code about what is private and what is public. That just may be different to the way that the city, the city as an institution, the city as a governing body, understands public and private.
Can you give me some examples of some of the projects that you deemed really significant in this kind of this general understanding of everything? And just to kind of illustrate some of these points a little bit, because I think we've talked about this idea of graffiti, but actually what I might be looking for is, I guess, the supporting evidence.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point. I think actually the video that we've got up here now, which is a work by Wurmke and Lankauf. So they're two Berlin-based German artists, and who have explored exploration in their work. Right, so one of the things about graffiti which I think is super important is being in the city, as I've talked about, and exploring the city, and going beyond the city, venturing beyond the city. And a lot of their works really look at that. They look at what happens when you kind of move beneath the city, right? So into subways, into sewers, or when you go above the city, when you go, up and beyond the places where you're normally supposed to go. So for them, the city kind of becomes looked at as a natural environment where, we can explore, we can travel, we can go above, below, and over. So for me, that was a work which was an amazing way of understanding what graffiti writers do, how they understand the city, not just as something to kind of produce on, but something to move through. So that is a way that you're seeing and you're trying to understand, or you're being enabled to understand what graffiti does without just seeing the image. Because as I was kind of saying before, the image is just one part. The image is critical, but it's just one part of this wider practice. And that kind of work helps to see what this kind of idea of urban exploration, of walking, of traveling through the city really does.
We're learning more today about the Oceanwide Plaza development in downtown LA. The towers you can see covered in graffiti.
In the last couple of years, we've seen these really quite dramatic cases of abandoned developments being completely taken over by graffiti artists. Now, what does this tell us about graffiti's role within understanding the city, or what it tells us about these about the housing situation within the city?
I think it's also a really important point. I talk about that a little bit in one of the chapters in the book, Why Show Works, by Andrew Cass, who had this amazing work in New York where he took over this plot in New York that had been kind of boarded up for decades. And likewise a work by Alterno and the artist Luce in Valencia, where they created holes so you could climb over these walls, which again were kind of covering over these abandoned plots that had been built by property developers who had then gone bankrupt, but they'd still remained kind of boarded off and separated from the city. So I think for graffiti writers and for other artists who've been influenced by that, making private spaces public is something which has always been really important, as well as making public spaces private, both ways of thinking about it. So I think with those huge, amazing acts where they've taken over these huge buildings which have been left abandoned, it does actually it starts to point towards the way in which property development can take over and then also leave totally separated from this city, these huge areas, which are brought back to life in many ways. And graffiti writers do this everywhere, right? These kind of, what I call the term I use in the book is terrain vague, right? These kind of abandoned sites of the city, which are kind of, brownfield sites or kind of these grey spaces, which graffiti writers have always engaged with, abandoned factories, kind of train tracks, spaces which are part of our urban surface, but outside of the structures where we can normally go through. So I think graffiti really highlights this, and it highlights this both visually and performatively.
What do you see as the difference between I guess these, I've labeled it into kind of 4 different sections of public art. It'd be graffiti, street art, mural, institutional public art. Or I guess you could have institutional public art and then monument. Might actually be separate. If I separated a commissioned, Yayoi Kusama to Churchill statue.
So I think on the one hand you have institutional and independent. So Javier Barker actually came up with the term independent public art, which I found incredibly useful. This is a way of bracketing kind of everything that's produced in the city without institutional permission. So you can then kind of separate it from institutional public art, which often public muralism or street art muralism becomes part of that. It's officially sanctioned, using huge infrastructure to form. To you could have murals which are produced through someone abseiling, right? So I think independent and institutional is a really good kind of separation to make. And then seeing everything which is in both of those kind of sections. On the institutional, you have from street art to super institutional monuments. And then from the independent, you have super accessible kind of mural practices that are still independently produced to the most kind of difficult or the most kind of insular graffiti. So I think there's 2 kind of broad frames that we can start thinking about it. And then, within that, delving into it in more depth.
When I look at the way that capitalism has essentially, done what capitalism does to street art, and the way it's completely packaged it up and it will shoot it back out, and actually now suddenly, instead of being the reason that the rent prices stay down, it's the reason that the rent prices go up. Can that happen with graffiti? Do you think capitalism is that fluid that it can absorb it and then spit it back out for profit?
So I think there's nothing outside capital. Almost.
It'd be naive to think that there was.
Almost. I think everything is co-optable. I mean, Foxton's estate agent used graffiti on their kind of their little minis recently. I've been getting random advertising new property in Shoreditch for £1 million, but with graffiti on the background. Graffiti has become part of that co-optation visually, not physically, but it is already part of this idea that a cool, hip, edgy area, all used in the worst kind of way, will have some graffiti in it. But the interesting thing is that that graffiti is always supposed to be impermanent, i.e., they eventually want it to go away. So clean whiteness is the goal, but on the way to that, graffiti definitely already has been co-opted as a visual aesthetic of something which is transforming rather than something that has transformed. Whereas I think street art is already at that space where it's not just doing the work for Capital, but it's also part of the kind of visual aesthetic of Capital now as well.
Where does the kind of, for you then, this balance sit? Where's the sweet spot? What does that kind of, that perfect space look like for you as an anthropologist?
Yeah, I think not as an anthropologist, but or just as a person, right? I'm also someone that is focus groups. I am part of that kind of community that these big privately owned spaces are trying to target. I've got a job, I like oak flat whites, right? I like kind of nice things. I've got a small child, I like safe spaces, right? So I'm being targeted for the way kind of these spaces are looking. I think the bottom line for me is that the kind of ever increasing privately owned public spaces, which we're seeing everywhere now, right? Kind of the newest public spaces we have in London are all privately owned. And I think, and they are, as I said, they are very, very clever, nuanced spaces that are very attractive to someone like me, right? That they have great art there, they have great curation there. But what they don't have is actually freedom, right? To be very honest, who is allowed to be in that space? What you're allowed to do in that space? No photography, no skateboarding, no busking, no protests. These are hyper restrictive spaces. So I think, and obviously there's no graffiti in those spaces either. They're highly surveilled spaces. So I think it's less than simply about finding the sweet spot than just kind of where do we want our cities to go? And I know that direction, which is this kind of frictionless, very kind of aesthetically nice sites, they are dangerous. I genuinely think they are dangerous to how we can be as a public and political body. So I would much rather have something which may look a lot uglier, doesn't matter what I like visually, but our freedom to actually act is not being curtailed.
It's such a loaded word, I have to sort of explore it or unpack it a little bit further. What do you mean by dangerous?
I think dangerous to our ability to be in public. My whole thing is about publicness. What is publicness really about? What does that mean in terms of how we can speak to one another? We are all in these echo chambers, and the city likewise is becoming an echo chamber where you're only speaking to people who have the same opinions as you and are just like you. And that is dangerous. I mean, we're seeing those dangers happening politically all over the world now. I think the idea of public space for me is about where difference kind of comes together. Whereabout you will be confronted with things that you may not like or opposing views that you have, but that we're forced to say, okay, well, we might have that opposing view, but we're all in this space together, and so we just need to get along with each other. So the danger for me of these kind of privately owned spaces where there is no graffiti, where there is no street art, well, there might be street art, there is no pollution, where everything is super nice, is that actually people can't come there, right? Whether that is about kind of a sexual or a racial or whether it's about age, whatever that is, whatever kind of identity kind of area it is that's being kind of curtailed from being in that space, there definitely is one, right? Those spaces are not about letting everyone in, they're about letting people in who will spend money there. So I think that really is the danger and the violence of those kind of spaces, which might be aesthetically pleasing, which might be made literally for me, but which are just not places that real publicness can occur.
You said the word identity within there, and I think there's a kind of a point I'd like to explore. It's 2024, identity lies at the heart. If you look at the kind of the overall collective of graffiti, what does that collective identity look like in your sort of subjective analysis, and what do you think that says about the culture?
I think the main thing you can say about graffiti is that outside of gender, which is the key issue, it is something that brings in everyone. I think the idea of graffiti emergent from the States as being something that was just Latinos and African American working class youth it totally belies the facts, right? It was a really kind of multicultural practice and also was like outside of like a class basis. There were people from...
Is it at the moment, would you say it's outside of a class structure?
I mean, from
How
my...
many Etonians are writing at the
You
most?
know what? Bizarrely,
More than you'd think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really spans. I think it goes beyond class, and I think it goes beyond race, like totally. The issue is gender, right? The issue is.
But there's a big but.
The issue is gender, right? And in my book, I've worked hard to ensure that there is as much representation from female artists as possible, which there is, because there's lots of artists, and this is more institutional artists, who are working with all the same ideas as graffiti, whether that is like going beyond like sight as something fixed and kind of breaking through kind of the structures of sight, or whether that's ephemerality, or whether that's style, like artists like Jenny Holzer and Barbara Kruger, but also Katarina Grosser or Clara Lydon, super interesting artists that have got a very similar way of understanding the city, understanding space, understanding private and public, but that haven't necessarily started within graffiti. So in terms of gender, which is probably the key thing within graffiti, that there's obviously like a hugely missing constituency, I think not that is for me a sociological issue. That's like when people start graffiti, they're like 11, 12, 13, and what our society thinks girls should be doing and thinks boys should be doing at that age in particular is really strongly defined. So I think the fact that there are less graffiti writers that are female than are male is not to do with graffiti itself being this like super macho, misogynistic kind of subculture. It's the fact that when people start, girls aren't supposed to like be outside late, be climbing over, walls and stuff, which obviously is itself also absurd, right? There is no, innate difference. Girls can be just as amazing graffiti writers than boys, can be just as adventurous, just as amazing explorers. And there have always been kind of like canonical graffiti writers, throughout every era who are female. So I think that really does come down to a sociological issue, but it is difficult when you're, presenting graffiti to then, have like that kind of like gender balanced set, which for me becomes much easier to kind of redetermine through thinking about who is working on these same issues, but maybe not has come from graffiti, but who can speak really closely with graffiti practice.
When we talk about these institutional spaces, particularly when you look at some of those projects that you mentioned and some of those artists that you just mentioned, in my kind of understanding is when you go into these spaces, if you see, Barbara Kruger or Jenny Holzer at the Serpentine, the word graffiti rarely appears. And what do you think there's still a reluctance, and there always will be a reluctance to actually just kind of call it as they see it within this culture? Or do you think that attitude's actually finally changing? Instead of graffiti, it's, uncommissioned public wall writing, and you're like, fuck off.
Yeah. I think institutions are still wary. The fact that we've got this in at Camden, the fact we are an exhibition here and a launch is like incredible. And I think there are sites like this which are more willing to have more kind of experimental practices within them. The Jenny Holzer show at the Tate, her kind of like four-room solo exhibition, she had a whole room with works between her and Lady Pink. And that was incredible. And I think that says a lot about Holzer, who is like always been like very clear how much graffiti influenced her practice in the 80s, right? So I think there are artists that have got that kind of willingness to kind of be very clear about their kind of arc and the way that graffiti has influenced it. But I think institutions are conservative. The art world is an extremely conservative world. And so there are these these barriers do still exist. But I think, you have to kind of work out how to burrow into institutions to make it really happen. But I'm very hopeful that we can do that more. I think it's critical in terms of that bigger picture of understanding what it is that like graffiti does. Understanding that, vandalism is something that's been inherent to art practice since the 50s and 60s. So really trying to reframe how we think about this practice.
What would you say then, let's say you're in the position of, public figure, you're Sadiq Khan, or you are Keir Starmer, you've got graffiti artists have been caught after, destruction of property, X amount. What's your solution, if in your ideal world, to these things? Because there will be people, I hope, there'll be people watching at this point, and there will be people that maybe aren't necessarily completely convinced about what all this means. And it's like, actually, look, if someone comes up and hits my, the front entrance to my shop, like, is there something there to protect that? And what would that structure legally look like for you?
I mean, I think people shouldn't go to prison for doing graffiti. I think, our prison system is, the UK prison system is a total mess as it is. The fact there are people inside category A prisons for graffiti is, from my mind, like, totally insane. That's the first part of it. So I think what's happened with graffiti is that its sentencing has totally correlates with the financial value of, like, the crime that was caused. And that has gone up, I think, something like 20-fold since the privatization of the train system. England in particular is one of the countries with the harshest kind of penal, it's a country who's given, like, the harshest penalties for graffiti. And, for me, that's the first element that should stop. Graffiti rarely happens on people's private property, right? It rarely happens on, it doesn't happen on people's cars. It might happen on vans, which seem to be commercial entities moving through the cities. It very rarely happens on people's private property. It's about being in what's considered public space, or it's in grey space. And I just think the way that the penalties for it correlate with the actual crime that is caused, for me, a criminal sentence is absurd.
Always, the case I always go back to was Vamp, and it was Stuart Hall. I don't know if you remember this one, the day that Vamp got sent down for 3.5 years, which at the time in the UK was the longest sentencing for a graffiti artist. And on the same day, the BBC sports presenter Stuart Hall was found guilty for 30 years of child-related sex offences, and he was given 15 months.
The 83-year-old has now admitted indecently assaulting 13 girls, including one 9-year-old.
So we just look at the way that we view these, property over the protection of people. It feels really completely disproportionate to where I think most people would actually put logic. We would say we want to protect each other first, and then property can be fixed. And I'm just trying to figure out what that kind of ultimate framework might look like, so that it can be kind of enactioned. And I think there's part of that idea of, like, putting forward, if you show people what that structure would look like, people are more able to picture it and to see what that might be. And I think, there's something in there. You seem as qualified as anyone to answer this question, so I'm going to ask you, how do you determine why one artist in particular defaces a public space and it's worth 3 million as opposed to another artist defaces the same public space and then gets sent to prison? How does that work?
So I think much of this is about like the very concepts of what art is and what very concepts of what, like, the canon is, right? So the example I give is, like, Ai Weiwei. Like, one of his most famous works was called, I think, Smashed Hand Dynasty Vase, or Dropped Hand Dynasty Vase, where he dropped a Han Dynasty vase, like a priceless part of our, part of the Chinese national heritage. And that's seen as artwork because it kind of works within, like, a kind of narrative of art history in which that kind of formally makes sense. So the art world, capital A, capital W, has, for me, very sadly, in the last definitely in the last 100 years, ideas of what art is has come to be totally determined by what's in their canon. Like, I see graffiti, I do see graffiti as an art practice, but with a lowercase a, in that it is separate to, although adjacent with, the institutional art world, right? But us only determining what art is through art institutions rather than to what is like a kind of aesthetic, public practice is, for me, so reductive. That's why, for me, like, wrestling, WWE, or, crocheting, or like any form of, like, craft or, like, public art practice, which might not be seen as art, for me, has got as much value as, like, Damien Hirst or Tracy Emin, whoever, like, the art institution sees as art. So I think much of this comes down to that. We think we have to be kind of taught what art is by art institutions. And therefore, if something is, like, super ugly, super, like, objectively, subjectively, super vandalistic in public space, but it's expensive and its artist is in the canon and in the collection of the Tate, then it's kind of okay. But if it's not, then it's pollution. So pollution anthropologically means if something's in the right or wrong place. So it's not any inherent value that it has, but it's if it's in the right or wrong place in that kind of normal idea, that kind of normalized idea. So for me, it's as simple as that. It's where do these objects sit and these artists sit on this hierarchy of value, which is, it's a narrative. It's nothing real. So that's why these kind of ideas of like vandalism really come into play, when it's like, that is not allowed, you can go to prison for it, or we usher that in and uphold it because it has an idea of value.
Which came first for you? Your love of graffiti or your love of anthropology?
Maybe I learned to love anthropology. I think graffiti, when I first started studying graffiti,
Did you look at it originally from an anthropological point of view? Were you interested and pulled in by this understanding of its role within the city?
So actually, when I was younger, I obviously knew lots of people who were writing graffiti, but music was like my passion, right? That was kind of like the direction, where my kind of creative energy got out. And then when I went back to study, when I was about 23, 24, I kind of drifted towards really thinking about kind of architecture and urbanism and space, but also thinking about different kind of ideas of what art could be. And that all kind of just flowed towards graffiti. It happened really quite naturally. And in that summer when I first started doing research, which was actually looking at the production and the destruction of graffiti, so I was working with graffiti writers, but also graffiti removal crews, and local kind of anti-graffiti kind of authorities. And during that project, I really just started, I increasingly became kind of slightly obsessed with graffiti. In particular, one writer, it was Rain Man actually, but I called him something different in my original article. But it was actually the artist Rain Man, who I called something different in the original article I wrote about this because of issues of anonymity. But his work really just started to capture me. He just, along with his pieces, he just had this tag to say Rain Man and have this dot, dot, dot afterwards. And there was just something about it that just really captured me. And the more I started working on graffiti and started working with graffiti writers, I really started to see kind of the transformative way they saw the city. The way they saw the visual nature of the city, the way they saw the possibilities of the city. And it's really been that I've been just constantly inspired by until this day. This kind of way of graffiti really being a total art form, where it's about the image and it's about the practice, but it's also about the whole environment in which that sits. And for me, that just makes it this just incredibly, constantly inspirational thing to look at.